Hey everyone, I'm Magical Hacker, and this is episode number 18 of the Eminence Podcast, the non-CEDH Commander podcast where I help you in the command zone with your deck building skills and on the battlefield with your deck piloting skills. This podcast is brought to you by New Dark Cloud and the rest of my patrons at patreon.com/magicalhacker. Today we'll be discussing the topic, rating every single rare and mythic from the sets of Phyrexia All Will Be One, Part 2. If you haven't listened to or watched the episode, Part 1, you'll definitely want to do that before this one. You can find the link to that episode whether you're on Spotify, it'll be in the description down below, or if you're on YouTube, you'll see that in the description down below as a link to that. So definitely watch that, otherwise you're only going to hear my ratings. You're not really going to know what they mean. What does it mean that this commander is a B? What does it mean if that other card is an S? Like, what does that mean? You'll definitely want to watch the episode where I go into all that. We've done already all of the colorless identity cards, all of the white color identity cards, all of the blue color identity cards, and all of the black color identity cards. All we have left to talk about are the red ones, the green ones, and the multicolored ones. So let's jump in with the first one that we're going to talk about here, which is All Will Be One, 5 mana for an enchantment that says, whenever you put one or more counters on a permanent or player, All Will Be One deals that much damage to target opponent, creature, and opponent controls, or planeswalker and opponent controls. And for this one, I've gave this one a rating of B. Because lots of decks care about counters, and in those decks, of course, this card is fine, but nothing to write home about. However, you can definitely build a deck where you're trying to combo with this. So you can play a couple of the cards that will combo here. You can do this, especially if you're doing a lot of mass reanimation, where you're reanimating creatures that enter with counters. And in those situations, I mean, this one becomes a seriously awesome card. So it's not going to be like the new ultra staple of Commander, but it's certainly something to keep in mind. And so for that reason, I gave it a B. I think that's fine. And by the way, this is kind of obvious, but this is a red card. We're starting off with the red cards here. So All Will Be One is one of the best red cards. And now we're going to go to one of the best cards in the set altogether. Seriously, this may be one of my favorite cards. I think I already said which one was my favorite earlier in the previous episode. But this one is probably my second favorite because it's just so cool. And that is Hexplate Wallbreaker. 5 mana for an equipment with equip cost of 4. It also has the Formiridan ability, which means that when this equipment enters the battlefield, create a 2/2 red rebel creature token, then you attach this to it. It also has the ability, equipped creature gets +2/+2, and, check this out, whenever equipped creature attacks, if it's the first combat phase of the turn, untap each attacking creature. After this phase, there is an additional combat phase, which is absolutely amazing. This one gets a rating of S, because, think about it, what decks would like this? Well, any deck that wants to use the combat phase of the turn in order to win. If you're trying to attack for the game, then this is going to be already really good. This is at the very least a 5 mana way to give all of your creatures the ability to attack one player, kill that player, and then attack a second player, kill that player. So this is really solid. Almost all decks either win or get value during the combat step. Of course, there are many decks that don't, but those are a minority nowadays in non-CEDH Commander. For all of those decks, this gives you 1 extra combat each turn for 4 mana each turn, or for free if you equip it to a creature that doesn't get blocked. So this is a fantastic card. I think the only other S that we talked about up to this point was the Eternal Wanderer. Let me just double check that because I'm kind of curious. But regardless, this is certainly one of those cards where we want to keep this in mind. Yeah, these are the only 2 cards that I gave S's to, the Eternal Wanderer and Hexplate Wallbreaker. I don't know why I keep saying Warbreaker. I guess it's gonna break wars too, apparently, everybody. Just keep that in mind. It's breaking walls just as much as I would say as Eternal Wanderer, at least in non-CEDH Commander, is what I'm expecting. Okay, next up, let's go to Red Sun's Twilight, which I gave a rating of B. It is a sorcery that costs X and 2 red that says destroy up to X target artifacts. If X is 5 or more, for each artifact destroyed this way, create a token that's a copy of it, but those tokens gain haste, and you exile them at the beginning of the next end step. The reason I gave this a rating of B was because really destroying X artifacts is a recipe for a, quote, build your own Vandal Blast, if you think about it that way. So the question that we ask now is the benefit here worth the increased costs? And really think about it too, you're going to get increased aggro because now you have no reason to say, I'm sorry that I hit your artifacts, Johnny. It was a mistake. It was an accident. No, because with this card, you actively paid more mana to target those extra artifacts. So what's the benefit here? We're getting one turn of a bunch of artifacts. So I don't think that really is very helpful. So I gave it a rating of B because it's good, but it's not great. And really, this goes for every deck. Every deck gets that kind of good but not great ability from Red Sun's Twilight, which, if you remember the chart that I talked about, that definitely puts it into the B category. S-A-B. Yeah, B category for that. So, could be good. I mean, I'm sure there's some decks that will take advantage of it much more. But really, you're depending on what your opponents are playing. And as long as you're doing that with this card, it's going to be kind of limiting the ceiling of it anyways. Okay, next up, let's go to an interesting card called Rook Hexgold Nabber. It's a 3-mana legendary 2/2 Goblin Rebel with Trample and Haste. Kind of weird that it has Trample. It's only a 2/2. And then it says this: whenever an equipped creature you control other than Rook Hexgold Nabber attacks or dies, you may attach all equipment attached to that creature to Rook. So, in the 99, I gave this one a rating of F. Okay, well, if I get a rating of F, why are we talking about it? And that's because I'm giving it a rating as the commander of B. Not a great rating, but, I think it's worth considering. Because when it comes to Voltron decks, I could potentially see this being a serious contender for one themed around equipment. Otherwise, it's not really that good in the 99 for equipment decks, because when are creatures dying, really? It's mostly during board wipes. And in those situations, Rook's dying too, so it doesn't really matter. But if you're playing an equipment-based Voltron deck, you get to do a couple of cool things. You get to have some creatures in there that, care about equipments. You can spread the equipments around, and then let's say a board wipe does happen, as long as you've built your deck where Rook has either a totem armor aura on him, or you've found a way to tutor up an indestructible equipment and place it on Rook, then it'll survive those board wipes, and all those other equipments from all these other creatures will get slammed right into Rook automatically. So that's kind of nice. Like I said, I'm not saying this is going to be, oh my gosh, the best Voltron commander out of the set. I don't think so. There's actually one coming up that I think is even better. But it's still something cool. I think if you build a Rook deck, you'll be surprised at how much more easy it is to win with it than you think. But that's not as good as the next card I'd like to talk about, which is Slowbad Iron Goblin. 3 mana for a legendary 3/3 Phyrexian Goblin Artificer. You can tap it, sacrifice an artifact, and then you get to add an amount of red mana equal to the sacrificed artifact's mana value. But you can spend this mana only to cast artifact spells or activate abilities of artifacts. So in the 99, I gave this a rating of B, but as a commander, I gave it a rating of A. So in a deck that's trying to make token copies of artifact creatures, this can convert temporary advantages into permanent ones. So you get whatever the ETB is, or whatever the leaves a battlefield ability of that artifact that you're making token copies of. You get to have that advantage, and then, before it gets exiled, because that's typically how Red does with artifacts, or rather with tokens, when it's making copy of things, it usually exiles them at the end step. With Slowbad, before they get exiled or sacrificed or destroyed or whatever happens with the effect that you've chosen, you can actually tap it, get some additional benefit out of those tokens as well. I think that's where the key is here. Slowbad Iron Goblin wants you to be playing token copies of artifacts. Like, that's the key here. And then you can just filter all that mana into new artifacts that you get on the battlefield. So in a deck of its own, I think that it gets even crazier, because now you can synergize with cards like Spine of Ishsaw, or even really, really basic cards like Ichor Wellspring, where you're making token copies of these things, or not. Maybe you're just literally playing those cards. Like, I'm trying to think about it this way. Let's say I play Ichor Wellspring, and I put it on, there's an artifact where you can imprint an artifact card from your hand onto it. The creature version is Soul Conduit, where you can make token copies of whatever creature you imprinted on it. The artifact one is called Prototype Portal. I think it's like a 4 or 5 mana artifact. Enter the battlefield, you choose an artifact from your hand, you put it under that thing, and now you can pay X mana and create a token copy of the exiled card, where X is the mana cost. Where Ichor Wellspring is a 2 mana artifact. When it enters or is put into the graveyard, you draw a card. Think about this. with Slowbad and the Prototype Portal with the Ichor Wellspring, you can tap the Prototype Portal, pay 2 mana, create the Ichor Wellspring token, draw a card, sacrifice it to Slowbad, draw another card, create 2 more red mana. You've done all this for free with just 3 cards, 2 other than the commander. You've drawn 2 cards and you've netted 0 mana. Like, you literally paid 2 mana and you got 2 red mana out of it. So definitely some awesome things that you can do with it. And I think that's something to keep in mind with Slowbad Iron Goblin. I keep wanting to say Golem, and I don't know why. Iron Golem must be a card in Magic. All right, next up, let's take a look here at Solfim Mayhem Dominus. 4 mana for a legendary 5/4 Phyrexian horror that says, if a source you control would deal non-combat damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals double that damage to that player or permanent instead. You can pay 1 generic mana and 2 red Phyrexian mana and discard 2 cards to put an indestructible counter on Solfim Mayhem Dominus. So, as a card in the 99, I gave this a rating of A, but as a commander, I gave this a rating of D. Because, let's say you're playing this as a commander, this card is screaming, attack my controller first, otherwise you'll die out of nowhere. That's really how this works. And as soon as it hits the battlefield, it'll be starting to say that, but if it's in the 99, it may be hitting the battlefield the same turn that you're going to be winning. But if you're playing it as a commander, it's going to be way visible way earlier than it's going to be able to actually win you the game. So in the 99, it's kind of like a surprise way for a deck that wants to win by non-combat damage, which is really a large number of decks nowadays, but it allows them to sneak through a win. Whereas if you're playing it as a commander, it's really scary. And that kind of makes it a little bit harder. I don't know if I'd ever want to use the ability, by the way, to put the indestructible counter on it. Discarding 2 cards is a really big cost. I don't know why they didn't just discard 1 card, because honestly, that feels like that would have been enough. Discard 2 cards kind of seems like overkill for me, at least for Solfim. So I don't know. Maybe I'm missing something, but that's what I think about Solfim. Next up, we've got Urabrask's Forge. 3 mana for an artifact that says, at the beginning of combat on your turn, put an oil counter on Urabrask's Forge, then create an X1 red Phyrexian horror creature token with trample and haste, where X is the number of oil counters on Urabrask's Forge. Sacrifice that token at the beginning of the next end step. I gave this card a rating of B. This really does feel like Red's Bitter Blossom, except it's more red. You don't get to save the tokens, but the token you're creating each of your turns, it is getting bigger and bigger. So this is a solid, it's kind of scary-ish, it's kind of slow-ish. I don't know. If you're playing a token deck or a proliferate deck, I feel like this is probably okay to include it in that deck. So that's Urabrask's Forge. Let's go now down to the first green card that we'll be talking about, which is Conduit of Worlds. It's a 4-mana artifact that says you may play lands from your graveyard. You can also tap it to choose target non-land permanent card in your graveyard. If you haven't cast a spell this turn, you may cast that card. If you do, you can't cast additional spells this turn. Activate only as a sorcery. This card is, it's an interesting one. I gave it a rating of B, because if your deck built around sacrificing your lands, I honestly think this is an excellent inclusion. Like, you're already using Crucible of Worlds, you're already using Ramunap Excavator. This is just another effect that's doing the same thing. You might as well play it. I don't know if I'd ever want to activate the ability here, but let's say you're playing a Self-Mill or Dredge style deck. Maybe there's a situation where you're going to want to be able to cast a non-land permanent card in your graveyard. So, I mean, it's kind of a big downside where you can't do it and something else at the same turn. But, I mean, that's just something that I think is part of the card that is limiting it, but doesn't necessarily make it worse. It just doesn't make it as good as it could be. So, overall, it's a fantastic card in that specific deck that wants to be playing Crucible of Worlds anyways. This is a good card in those decks for sure. Okay, next up, we're going to go to we're going to skip down quite a few here past the green cards. I don't know why I always find myself having a hard time liking green cards, but there are a few here that I think you'll be surprised on my thoughts on. Next up, we've got Nissa Ascended Animist. This costs a total of 7 mana. However, 2 of that mana is in the form of green Phyrexian mana. So it's a Planeswalker. It's a Nissa Planeswalker that enters with 7 loyalty, but because it has that completed ability, each of those Phyrexian manas that you pay 2 life for instead of the green mana, you're going to make Nissa enter with 2 fewer loyalty counters. So you can pay 7, get a 7 loyalty Nissa. You can pay 6 and 2 life. You'll get a 5 loyalty Nissa Planeswalker, or you could play 5 mana and 4 life and get a 3 loyalty Nissa Planeswalker. So let's talk about the activated abilities here. +1, create an XX green Phyrexian horror creature token, where X is Nissa's ascended animus' loyalty. -1 to destroy target artifact or enchantment, and then -7 until end of turn. Creatures you control get +1/+1 for each forest you control and gain trample. This card I gave a rating of B because if you're playing a mono green deck that cares about creatures, especially token creatures, this is honestly a very powerful win condition. In other token decks, this is still a solid card. I think it's important to keep that in mind. But definitely the dream scenario is you're playing mono green, you care about tokens, you've got this as a way to pay 7 mana, and now you can immediately cast it, ultimate it right away, and all of your creatures are getting +1/+1 for each forest you control and trample. I mean, that can really win the game out of nowhere. Think about it. Craterhoof Behemoth, it gets +1/+1 and trample to all of your creatures based on the number of creatures you control. Now, what do you think is more likely in a mono green deck? Are you going to have more creatures or more forests? To me, I think it's kind of obvious you're going to have more forests. So that's why I look at Nissa and think of it as a really good card for mono green decks specifically. Okay, next up, we're going to talk about Thrun, Breaker of Silence. So, let me read off this card. This is a really cool card. I wish more people were talking about this card because it's certainly something that is doing a lot of really cool things. So, Thrun, Breaker of Silence, 5 mana for a legendary 5/5 Troll Shaman. Can't be countered, and it has trample. And it can't be the target of non-green spells your opponents control or abilities from non-green sources your opponents control. And as long as it's your turn, Thrun has indestructible. So as a card in the 99, I don't think this is a surprising grade, but I'm giving it a rating of F. It's really not that good in a 99 of a deck. But as commander, I'm giving this an S. What deck wants to play a hexproof, trample, uncounterable, partially indestructible creature? Not a lot of decks, but as a Voltron, you can focus just on totem armor, indestructible, and buffs. And that's it. You've got the trample, you've got some of the other protection abilities, and so you're really good. You can just literally, I'm going to focus on giving totem armor / indestructible. I've already pretty much got hexproof and buffs, and now I'm going to make my Thrun, Breaker of Silence really big. Now, one side note that I really should be talking about here when it comes to Thrun as a Voltron deck. If your game plan is to go turn 2 ramp, turn 3 ramp, turn 4 Thrun, equip bunch of stuff, or enchant bunch of stuff, turn 6 enchant and equip more stuff, attack and start, you're really not going to be having a good time because opponents are seeing it. They're not blind to what you're doing. And if you're doing that, you're taking the slowest way to win from the moment you're starting to try. So what you really should be doing with Thrun, I think, is playing a much slower game when you're talking about non-CDH. Turn 2, maybe you don't do anything. Turn 3, maybe you don't do anything, which sounds like, oh my gosh, how could you ever recommend that? But I really do think this is going to be the way to play because this is based on the experiences I've been having over the past decade where not being the scariest person at the very beginning of the game is the easiest way to get to a win. So with this Thrun deck, the way I'm envisioning it is you're kind of not doing much. Maybe turn 3, you play a Darksteel Mirror. It's just a 0/1 for 3 mana that has indestructible. That's literally all it is. And you're just playing it out there so that people don't want to attack you because it's like, why am I going to attack him? He's just going to block. And I don't even get to, he doesn't lose his creature. I don't lose my creature. I might as well just not even attack at that point because now I have an extra blocker. So people just kind of get the idea that they don't want to attack you. You can also play some cards like Howling Moon, which creates tokens for you. There are other examples of this like Wolfcaller's Howl. There's that one that makes snake tokens. I think it's Snake Pit. Whenever an opponent casts a blue or black spell each turn, anytime they cast any of those spells, you're going to get a 1/1 token. And so you can start blocking things like easy. So you can do all this stuff kind of pillow forting up a little bit in mono green, which sounds kind of crazy. And then when you've done a ton of big ramp spells, like what's a good example? I mean, Skyshroud Claim is great. I mean, kind of think of cards like that, where you're trading in one card for ramping 2 or 3 amount, 2 or 3 lands worth of ramp per card that you're casting. And then eventually you can get to the point where people are kind of lower on life total. You can use Thrun, buff them up really quickly, And then you can even maybe find ways to give him haste and attack someone, get someone out of the game. Your two opponents are out of answers. They've been using stuff on each other. They're kind of struggling to find a way to answer a threat because he's already got a lot of this built-in protection. Then you can just take out one person at a time, and I think it's going to be a walk in the park, really. In my opinion, I think if you build that way, Thrun as a commander can be very, very powerful in non-CEDH. Because even when opponents know what you're trying to do, they're still not going to want to fight the good fight, if you want to think about it that way. They're not going to be wanting to spend their combat steps getting rid of your little dorky 1/1 snake tokens so that they can start attacking you when other opponents are starting to set up their combo kills, or they've ramped out already in turn 3 and they've got like 6 gajillion mana out there and they're super scary. They're not going to want to be attacking you, even though they know if we get to the late game, you're going to clean house. They're still not going to want to do it. So yeah, Thrun, Breaker of Silence, I think out of all the commanders in these sets, I think Thrun is going to be the easiest to win with if you play the way that I outlined earlier. Okay, next up, let's go to Tyrannix Rex. This one's an interesting one. I gave it a rating of B. It's a 7 mana AA creature that can't be countered either. It's got Trample, Ward 4, Haste, and Toxic 4. So players dealt combat damage by this creature also get 4 poison counters. You'll notice this is the first toxic creature I've talked about this whole podcast, I think. I don't think I've ever talked about... Maybe I talked about... Actually, no, I talked about Skrelv. I did talk about Skrelv. And I talked about Skrelv's Hive, too. I think those are the only other cards that have toxic on them that I've talked about up to this point. I could be wrong. I just don't remember. But Tyrannix Rex, it's kind of interesting that I talk about this card, and I haven't talked about everything else. And I think the reason I'm giving it a rating of B, because in an Infect deck, this puts an opponent on a 3-turn clock immediately by itself, right? Because you attack with it. They have to have 8 toughness worth of blocking so that they don't get 4 poison counters. If they have 7 toughness, they're getting 4 poison counters. That's a big deal. And how are they going to get rid of this? It's got Ward 4. They've got to pay 4 extra mana. If they want to Source to Plowshare this, they're going to have to pay 5 mana to do it. People don't like doing that. And it's got haste. That's kind of crazy. So if you have other Infect creatures, I mean, it certainly gets a lot stronger because now you don't have to do all 3 attacks with this at one player. You can maybe do this as the final kill. Or if you have damage doublers, that's another interesting thing where you can give this double strike or you get extra combat steps. Those are all really good ways to get the toxic count up. So this is just one of the most amazing pieces of poison counter giving in the set if you're playing an Infect deck. And I am playing an Infect deck, and I think I added this one to it because I think it's just that good. I truly believe this is the best toxic creature for any commander deck that wants to kill opponents with poison counters. And I really do think I stand behind that because, again, going back to the same approach that I have with commander, it doesn't matter if you get down your Glistener Elf on turn 1. You're not going to win a game of commander with a Glistener Elf. Right? It's too small, it's too slow, it's too telegraphed. It's just not worth it. Tyrannix Rex can really get the job done, I would say. Okay, last green card here, Zopandrel Hunger Dominus. It's a 7 mana legendary creature, 4/6 Phyrexian horror with reach. At the beginning of each combat, double the power and toughness of each creature you control until end of turn. You can pay 2 Phyrexian green mana and sacrifice 2 other creatures to put an indestructible counter on Zopandrel Hunger Dominus. In the 99, I gave this a B rating, and as a commander, I gave this a B rating. As mentioned previously, the combat step can be a win con for many decks, and in those decks, this is a really good card. It's also much better at surviving board wipes by, compared to every other Dominus. I think this is one of the best ones, if not the best Dominus for getting that indestructible counter, because you never have to hold up mana. And if you have other creatures, you don't really have to do anything else either. You can I have creatures, my whole board is about to be wiped by a board wipe. Well, I'm going to sacrifice 2 of the creatures that would die anyways, pay 4 life, and now at least I get to keep my Zopandrel Hunger Dominus, which is really, really good. So, really good at surviving board wipes because you're sacrificing creatures that would be dying anyways. So it's just a solid card. If you're playing a deck that's toxic based, it's funny. This card, it's like the one kind of combat deck that it non-bows with is the combat deck that was invented in the same set. Like this does not help toxic almost at all. Maybe it makes your tramplers a little bit bigger so they're more likely to deal the toxic damage, but there's not increasing their toxic output at all. It's just making it more likely that they get through if they already have trample. So it's just an interesting card. I definitely like it for decks that are trying to win. If you're playing a horror tribal deck, this is a solid card to include if it's green, which I mean, some horror decks are going to be green. But I just think this is very, very good for getting combat to be more painful and more likely to win the game. Okay, let's now finish up by talking with all of the cards that have a multicolored color identity. Starting off with Azuri, Stalker of Spheres, 4 mana for a legendary 3/3 Phyrexian Elf Warrior. When it enters the battlefield, you can pay 3 mana. If you do, proliferate twice, and whenever you proliferate, you draw a card. I gave this one a rating of B as the 99 and B as commander. In any proliferate deck, including green and blue, this card feels like an auto-include. Otherwise, it's not really that great for commander decks. If you're playing it as a commander, you can really abuse this card for a proliferate deck, winning more easily if you actually avoid poison counter cards. Because once you kind of show the opponents that not only are you playing Azuri, you're also playing poison counters in the deck, it's going to be very, very scary, and they're going to want to take you out before you really can do a whole lot of cool stuff. It's very interesting that 3 generic mana, I really see that as being only active if you're playing this in the 99. I mean, I'm sure you could build a deck where you want your commander to be 7 mana so that it enters the battlefield and proliferate twice. I'm sure you can build a deck like that. I just don't see that really being worth it. I think it's a lot better to get Azuri down early, 4 mana, and then you're proliferating, and while you're proliferating, you're getting extra card draw off of Azuri. It's in a lot of ways like, what's that green and blue card from Return to Ravnica block? It has Evolve, and whenever you put a +1/+1 counter on it, you draw a card. The name is blanking for me right now, but that's okay. You can definitely use a proliferate deck with this card and do a lot of really cool stuff. Next up, let's go to Glissa Sunslayer. 3 mana for a legendary 3/3 Phyrexian zombie elf with first strike and death touch. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you choose one of these. Either A, you draw a card and you lose 1 life, B, you destroy target enchantment, or C, you remove up to 3 counters from target permanent. So, what's this at the very best? It's not that great. What is at the worst? Let's just say, what's the floor for this card? At the floor, this is a Shadow Mage Infiltrator, right? So you're attacking with it, probably not going to get blocked because it's got first strike and death touch. And then you're going to be, most of the time, drawing a card if you have nothing else to do. You can just draw a card. Yeah, you lose 1 life, but, I mean, that's Phyrexian Arena anyways. So you're drawing a card every turn, an extra card off your Glissa Sunslayer, and you're dealing 3 damage. That's not that bad. Let's say you're playing Double Strike in your deck, and you can give Glissa Double Strike. Hey, now you're dealing 6 damage, drawing 2 cards. Yeah, you lose 2 life, but it's not a big deal. But here's where I think this is really cool. As the commander, the reason I gave it a commander rating of A here, whereas in the 99 I gave it only a C rating, is because I don't like sagas. I'm not a big fan of them. I love enchantments, not a fan of sagas, and I think I know why too. Sagas are the fragility of enchantments, which, you know, granted they're not that fragile, but they're still more fragile than other things, with also the downside of sorceries in that they only have a certain effect. So sagas are like really slow sorceries that can be destroyed with enchantment removal so that your opponents can prevent you from getting the full effect. So that's why I'm not a big fan of sagas. But with Glissa, now you get rid of at least just one of those problems, which is now you get to continue to use it over and over and over. So if you can find sagas where you like the first 2 abilities, obviously, the third ability is going to be pretty good usually, but you can't use Glissa the Sunslayer. Glissa Sunslayer is not going to work very well with those abilities off of the sagas. But anyways, I'm getting down a rabbit hole. Really, this is a great card as a commander if you want to make a saga deck. And I would love to make a saga deck. I think this is pretty cool. There's already a green-white commander for sagas. Who knows? Maybe you want to do an Abzan saga deck. It'd be kind of cool. All right, next up, let's go to Kaito Dancing Shadow. This is a 4 mana legendary 3 loyalty Kaito Planeswalker that says, whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, you may return one of them to its owner's hand. If you do, you may activate loyalty abilities of Kaito twice this turn rather than only once. Here are the activated abilities. +1, up to 1 target creature can't attack or block until your next turn. 0, draw a card. And -2, create a 2/2 colorless drone artifact creature token with death touch, and When this creature leaves the battlefield, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So this is not a commander card. The only multicolored cards in this set that are not commanders are planeswalkers, which is kind of interesting. They only, in all these sets really, multicolored means either you're a planeswalker or you're a commander. So I wish they would kind of focus on helping people be more excited to play monocolored commanders, but I definitely don't want to get on that soapbox, at least not right now. So for Kaido Dancing Shadow, of course, if you're playing a ninjutsu deck, this card is amazing. This is giving you that ability to reuse your ninjas, so obviously it's going to be very good. But if you're playing a Super Friends deck, or maybe a Death Touch deck, there are some advantages to this card where you might actually want to include it, right? And so I think that's really, really helpful, because a 4-mana Planeswalker that can +1 to make a creature not be able to attack until your next turn, that's very good to protect your Planeswalkers from whatever the biggest creature on the board is. If there's no big creature, you can 0 to draw a card. That's awesome too. Or you can always -2 to create a Death Touch token. That's really hard to attack through for a Super Friends deck. So it's a really good card there in Super Friends, Death Touch deck, Artifact deck, and I'm sure there's plenty other decks too that would want to have that card. Next up, we've got Kaya, Intangible Slayer. This is a 7-mana legendary 6 loyalty Kaya Planeswalker with hexproof that has 3 activated abilities. You can +2 to make each opponent lose 3 life and you gain 3 life. 0, you draw 2 cards, then each opponent may scry 1. And -3, exile target creature or enchantment. If it wasn't an aura, create a token that's a copy of it, except it's a 1/1 white spirit creature with flying in addition to its other types. A lot of abilities here, but I gave this a rating of B. If you're playing a Super Friends deck that is interested in high mana value walkers, and honestly I have a Super Friends deck that I think that is the case for it, then this is a real consideration for its theft ability and its double card draw ability. I feel like in terms of Planeswalkers, if you're interested in ones that cost 7 mana, this one is one of the best ones that are costing 6 mana or more. It's really solid for a Super Friends deck, and I'm sure there's other places where it's really good too. If you're playing a deck that cares about drawing a lot of cards, Kaya might be a really good inclusion there. If you are a theft deck and you have white and black in your mana, in your color identity, then that -3 is really good. Being able to exile an enchantment, think about it. I'm going to exile your, let's just say, Rhystic Study. And I'm going to make my own copy of a Rhystic Study, except it's a token that I can proliferate and make more copies of. So it's really powerful in terms of decks that care about what this wants to do. I think you can really make a strong card using Kaya in the 99. Next up, let's go to Kethek, Crucible Goliath. It is a 4-mana legendary 4/4 Phyrexian beast that says, at the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice another creature. If you do, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a non-legendary creature with lesser mana value, put it onto the battlefield, then put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. In the 99, I gave this a rating of D, but as Commander, I think it's a B rating because they were really scared to make this card good, and honestly, for that I'm thankful because this could have been a lot worse. The best way to use this one, though, isn't really like a sneaky way, okay, like how can I, make sure that I'm getting, I don't think that's how you do it. I think you just generate value with it. The best way to generate value with this card is with non-token creatures that self-recur. So Persist is an example of this, Undying, lots of skeletons have abilities that can self-recur. I don't know if I would count Dredge in there, but maybe you would. You would count Dredge into that too. Really, because it cares about sacrificing creatures and then you find a lesser mana value card, then you really don't want to be sacrificing 1 mana value cards or tokens. So you've got to sacrifice non-tokens, and then you've got to have really just big ones that can go back onto the battlefield for whatever you're paying the ability with. So Persist is an example, Undying, Skeletons, etc. So kind of keep that in mind. I think that makes it a lot better as a commander where you can build around it. Whereas in the 99 of a deck, that's not easy to build around. There's not many decks that will care about doing those exact things. Next up, we've got Malcator, Purity Overseer. This is a 3-mana legendary 1/1 Phyrexian Elephant Wizard that when it enters the battlefield, you create a 3/3 colorless Phyrexian Golem artifact creature token, and at the beginning of your end step, if 3 or more artifacts enter the battlefield under your control this turn, create a 3/3 colorless Phyrexian Golem artifact creature token. So really, there's two ways to create those 3/3 tokens. It's either by blinking Malcator, every time it enters, it'll create one, or at each end step, if 3 or more artifacts enter the battlefield under your control this turn, you'll create another token. So for hard artifact heavy decks, this could potentially be the source of medium-sized tokens turn after turn, which is why it gets a rating of D as a card in the 99, but as commander, it gets a rating of A because it's not very scary. So it's probably better as a commander than in the 99. Of course, we talked about this already a couple of times. It's smarter to play a strong 99 with a weak commander, and I think Malcator fits the bill pretty good for that because you can just use it to create tokens, and you've got this artifact theme. You can even play the Golem tribal cards. There's a good couple of them. There are some really common and fun green ones that I wish we had access to, but it's okay. Malcator is still a solid card in Azorius. Okay, next up, we're going to go down to Nayali Sun's Vanguard. This is a 4-mana legendary 3/3 human rebel that says, attacking tokens you control have double strike. Whenever one or more tokens you control attack a player, exile the top card of your library. During any turn you attacked with a token, you may play that card. As a card in the 99, I gave this a rating of B. As commander, I gave this a rating of C. And the reason for that is because in a token-centric deck, this card can act as a win con or as an accelerator because it's got both the double strike ability and the card draw ability too. So you got two options what you can use it for. The problem is, as the commander, your opponents are no longer surprised by the math being so much more in your favor. So you kind of lose out on the ability to use it as an effective win con without being, reactively attacked because of the way that your commander looks. So in the 99, I think this is a solid inclusion for token decks that have red and white. As commander, it's okay. It's just not that great. Next up, we've got Othari, Sun's Glory. 5 mana for a legendary 3/3 Phoenix. That's legendary, and it's got flying, lifelink, and haste. Whenever Othari, Sun's Glory attacks, you get an experience counter. Then create a 2/2 red rebel creature token that's tapped and attacking for each experience counter you have. You also can pay 4 mana, tap an untapped rebel you control to return Othari from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. That last ability, I'm sure it'll come up a lot of times, but I definitely don't want to build around it, which is what you'd be doing if you're building a rebel deck. I think it's nice when you can use the tokens that Othari's already created to be able to bring Othari back, but it's not really that important to be able to do it in the command zone. In the 99, I give this a rating of C. As commander, I gave this a rating of B. Of course, this is a solid card for token decks, and because you're creating a lot of tokens with this card. It's got haste, it's got flying, it's got lifelink too, which is kind of nice, of course. It's probably playable for decks that care about attack triggers or experience counters, but I think it's a little bit better as the commander, where you can use cards like Cathar's Crusade as a surprise win. It doesn't necessarily need to be as good as Cathar's Crusade. There's also another card, I think the name is Gold Knight Commander, where it says whenever a creature enters the battlefield, creatures you control get +1/+1. So you can attack with Othari, make 3 2/2s, and then you'll trigger that card 3 times. Now all of your creatures get +3/+3. Now you've got, just Othari by itself with this Gold Knight Commander. You've got a 6/6 flying lifelink haste going somewhere, and you've got 3 5/5s that are attacking wherever you want as well. So it's really, really solid, I think, as the commander. It's certainly not the best because it is kind of scary, so kind of keep that in mind. You can maybe find a way to try to appear less scary in spite of how scary this commander can be. The fact that it's just creating tokens may not be that scary for your opponents. It just depends. I think it really depends. Next up, we've got Ovika, Enigma Goliath. This was an expensive one. 7 mana for a legendary 6/6 Phyrexian Nightmare with flying. And the ward cost here is 3 mana and 3 life. So you got to pay 3 mana and pay 3 life if you want to target this with spells or abilities. Otherwise, those spells and abilities get countered. The other ability here besides flying and ward that it has is whenever you cast a non-creature spell, create X 1/1 red Phyrexian Goblin creature tokens, where X is the mana value of that spell. They gain haste until end of turn. As a card in the 99, I give this a rating of A. It's a really solid card. It might be tough to play this and then play other things afterwards, but if you can stick this on the battlefield, this can generate a lot of value ways to win the game, ways to stay alive. I think it's very solid in the 99. As a commander, though, it's not. It's going to be way too scary in a multiplayer game, so I give it a rating of D. Let me go through all the decks that might want to have this card in the 99. Artifact decks, enchantment decks, spellslinger decks, vehicle decks, Super Friends decks, right? All of these cards that care about these non-creature permanents, that is going to be a great card for that. Let's say you're playing a token deck, not playing a lot of creatures. This card is going to want to go in there too. So this is a really powerful card. Great in the 99. Too powerful as commander. It's going to make you the target at the table. A lot of times you're going to get attacked a bunch. I don't see you living very long to be able to use Ovica and to do much of anything if you choose to use it as your commander, unless you make the deck really powerful and oppressive and kind of tying people's hands behind their back so they can't interact with you. Not because they don't want to, but because they can't. And, that's a fair way to build decks, but at the same time, I just think you're fighting an uphill battle that you don't necessarily need to be. You could do things a little bit easier if you wanted to. All right, last card, and I think this is fitting to end with this card. It is Urtet, Remnant of Memnarch. 3 generic mana for a legendary artifact creature, Mirror, 2/2. Wait a second, generic? I thought we were talking about multicolored cards here. What's going on? Don't worry, you'll find out. Whenever you cast a Mirror spell, you create a 1/1 colorless Mirror artifact creature token. At the beginning of combat on your turn, untap each Mirror you control. And then you can pay 1 mana of each color, so white, blue, black, red, green. There we go, got color identity multicolored there. You can pay 5 mana, tap it, to put 3 +1/+1 counters on each mirror you control, but activate this only during your turn. So obviously when people saw this card, they were like, oh my goodness, we finally have a mirror tribal card. And I think that's great. I think that's really good. But you got to remember, there's not a whole lot of those. So as a card in the 99, this gets a rating of F. As commander, it's got a pretty good rating. I'd say a rating of B. Because if you have a 5-color mirror deck and you're not using this commander, I don't know why. I have a big question mark. Like, why not use this card? This card isn't immediately threatening, and it's actually pretty good for a mirror tribal deck with your artifact and creature recursion aplenty. Honestly, it seems pretty solid. Of course, you're not able to continue to put those counters on it every turn. You can only activate the ability during your turn. But hey, Mirror's got lots of abilities, and one of my favorite creatures of all time is Darksteel Mirror. So I'm a big fan of Mirror cards. Am I going to build it? No, but it's still a cool card, and I think it deserves its rating of B here. So that is all the cards that we can talk about today. Now, I know if you didn't watch that first episode, you saw me skip over a bunch of red, green, and multicolored cards, and you might be thinking, oh my gosh, why didn't we talk about those? Don't worry, we talked about that at the very beginning of the first episode, where I went through all of the cards that received an F grade, a D grade, or a C grade, and I just listed them off and said we're not going to be talking about that card, those cards. Otherwise, this podcast would not be part 1, part 2. It'd be part 5 or part 6. I mean, we'd be talking about cards for a long time. There's a lot of rares and mythics in these sets, 105. So I like to talk a lot, but not that much. That's way too much for me. So that's my take. Of course, if you disagree or if you have any questions or comments, you can always leave me a comment at youtube.com/magicalhackermtg or send me a tweet at twitter.com/magical__hacker. Speaking of which, let's take a look at some of the comments that you all left for me on YouTube. Starting off with Johnny Whizbang 1 month ago on episode 12, which is titled, Can I Build a Commander Deck That is Good in Multiplayer and 1v1? Also known as the Wizard's Riddle episode. Johnny says, one big problem with not trying to be too scary early is that it can be hard to judge what people will find scary if you're not always playing with the same group. I think that's a great point, because I think we have to think about what we can say we are accepting as being likely to cause people to be afraid of your commander, right? There's multiple things. You talk to one person, okay, I'm afraid of blah, blah, blah. You talk to another person, they're afraid of something totally different. Okay, what's something that we can say kind of across the board? There are some people who are not afraid of it, but you can be relatively confident that this is something you can build around people thinking of as being scary. And honestly, I think of 3 things that I think about that people are typically scared of. First of all, I think they're very scared of any commander that they know is very strong, which typically means a commander that's powerful, because not only are people more attracted to stronger commanders, and therefore they're going to be more likely to build that commander, meaning that rating on EDHREC is going to be higher because more people are playing that card because it's strong, but also if it's a lot of people playing that card, they've seen how it works. They have experience with it being a strong commander. So when they see your Oloro deck again, they're not going to be thinking, it's just Oloro. Just gaining 2 life. What's the problem, right? No, that's not what they're thinking. They're thinking, oh my gosh, there's an Oloro player at the table. What do I do to take them out right away? Because they have experience with that commander. They know why it's a scary card. So that's the first thing. A popular commander, a strong commander, that will really make your opponents afraid of you. So if you want to try to play around that and not be super scary, then the best thing to do is not play a popular commander, right? That's the best way to do it. If you don't mind losing and not doing a whole lot in your games, go for it. That's the way I say. But if you do play a popular commander, a very scary one, I don't think it's fair to say, why am I getting attacked so much? You have to remember that's part of the game. That's part of how it works. You can't have it both ways. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't have the popular commander and have people leave you alone. That's just not how it works. So first thing that I think we can assume from our opponents is going to be scary popular commanders. Number 2, having a lot of mana very early on. If it's turn 4 and you've got 7 mana, well, I'm sorry, but you're going to be very scary at the table, right? If it's turn 8 and you've got 15 mana, you're probably not that scary. Maybe you're a little scarier, but not as scary as when you were on turn 4 when you had 7 mana. Why? Because people had more things that they could do. They had more cards that they could cast to slow you down. They had creatures that didn't get board wiped that they could attack you with. So there's a lot of things to think about. Mana is good. Just don't try to make it so that you have the most as quick as possible. Try to make it so that you have the most when people are winning, which is in the late game. So fast mana is number 2. Last one, fast card draw like Necropotence. Kind of in the same category as fast mana, where if you're getting a resource really, really early on, unless you have both of those two things together, fast mana and fast card draw at the same time, you're probably going to be having a hard time fending off 3 opponents who are all going to be unwillingly attacking you together. They're going to be allying together because they all agree that you are the scariest one at the table. So if you want to avoid that, just avoid those cards. Now you can play something else in their place that will give you more benefits later on in the game, and you can use them a little bit more easily. I think Jerhava makes a great point here that there is a 4th thing where you can add to this list of 3 things. If you're going super aggro or snowballing really fast and you're starting to move life totals very quickly, people definitely take notice. I think that's 100% true. And I think that may be, somewhere between 1 and 2 in terms of how likely it makes people afraid of you. And so there's an episode coming up. We'll talk about it a little bit later, talking about what you can do to get around that. Let's do one more question here for today, and then we'll close out. Felipe Bronco on episode 11, is Phyrexian Arena always good, always bad, or only good in certain decks? Says, with regards to the rampant growth argument, I'm more in favor of playing Dorks on turn 1 and Cultivate/Kodama on turn 2, which has the same effect as Rampant, plus the benefit of ensuring your next land drop. But even then, when it comes to ramp in green, I tend to favor the creature-based versions due to creature synergies with the color. So this is something that I've thought about for a long time. There was a point in my life where I said, look, creatures as ramp, X. No way. None. 0. I am not playing any creatures as my ramp because creatures die to board wipes, which is true. But then I realized, I think everything we do in a deck, we have to remember you're getting a plus and there's a benefit and there's a disadvantage, right? You're getting both of those things together. So if there's a creature that can tap to produce a ridiculous amount of mana for me, then that's a big benefit. Yes, there's a risk that it'll die to a board wipe, but that risk is not high enough where I'm going to say completely no exceptions, no creatures as ramp. So over time, I've become more open to the idea of having creatures as ramp, to where now I'll play like 2 or 3 cards in a deck that are ramp cards, but they're also creatures. However, that said, I don't think playing Dorks on turn 1 is a great use of the card slot. Meaning, would I rather have a Llanowar Elf in a deck, or would I rather have a basic forest? Well, let's take a look at the 2 advantages. A Llanowar Elf allows you to have 1 mana, same thing with the basic forest, so they're kind of the same there. But the Llanowar Elf doesn't get limited by the number of land drops you can make per turn, meaning you can get that Llanowar Elves down on turn 1 and get used to that mana turn 2 and turn 3 and turn 4 until you get board wiped, and then it's gone, right? The basic forest, you only get to use that mana once it would be the first turn you would miss out on your land drop. Take a look in your games. Find out what's on average the first turn when I miss a land drop. And then that's what you have to think of as being the advantage to having a basic land. And so if for you it's on turn 5 or on turn 6, then that means that the Llanowar Elves is only better than the forest turns 2, 3, 4, 5, and then maybe 6, depending on where you answered for that question. That's not a big part of the game. That's not when games are being ended either. So is it really worth it? Maybe in your deck it is. Maybe there's a lot of synergies. Felipe here is talking about creature synergies in green. Maybe you've got heroic protection, where you can give all your creatures indestructible and hexproof, and so you're going to survive the board wipe. You're going to be fine. Maybe you're playing Rise of the Dark Realms, and so you're going to be reanimating all those creatures anyways, and so it's okay if they get board wiped. There's lots of things that you can do to help keep those creatures out there. I'm not opposed to creatures as ramp. The thing that I'm opposed to more is cards that are being used as ramp that don't produce more mana than a basic land. That's what I'm looking for. I'm always looking for my ramp cards to individually be producing more mana than a basic land in that slot would be producing. I'm always looking for that, and I think that's my focus, right? So Cultivate and Kodama, this kind of toes the line. It is kind of nice that you can produce the 1 mana from the card, but you also get to find a land to your hand. I've never found myself in a deck where I needed to resort to those, but those are things that I'm keeping in the back of my mind as a plan B option. Let's say for some reason I can't have any other ramp cards. Let's say I'm playing a green deck that has Obosh as my companion, and I don't want to be playing 5-drop cards that much. Maybe I'm playing 1 of them, but I don't want to play a bunch of them. Yeah, in that type of situation, I could definitely see myself using Kodama's Reach and Cultivate, right? I could see myself using those 2 cards in a situation like that. But if I'm not limited that way, I'm probably going to have some other green spells that I like more, such as Elemental Resonance, Market Festival, Sky Shroud Claim, right? There's these cards that I'm a really big fan of that I always like to go to. There's another card that's like Market Festival that I'm blanking on, but it does the same thing. It just has a different name. So there's a lot of good cards that I like. So yes, there might be a situation where I could find myself liking Cultivate and Kodama, but I'm not really super excited to be playing it out on turn 2. I don't need to go that fast. I don't want to go that fast. I want to look slower than my opponents so that my opponents spend more resources slowing each other down rather than slowing me down. So that way when I do start to accelerate, it's in the late game when they've already used up all their answers, and we're getting closer to winning the game where I can use that acceleration to propel me into a momentum that actually allows me to end up as the winner. So that wraps up the time that we have today for answering questions. If you want to pick the topic for an episode of the Eminence Podcast, check out patreon.com/magicalhacker. In fact, the topic for the next episode will be, how can you build a tribal deck without becoming the threat? So make sure to subscribe on YouTube or follow on Spotify to get notified of that episode when it comes out. Thank you again to New Dark Cloud. Thank you again to all of my patrons. And thank you for listening. Stay awesome, everybody.